South Korea as cinema. It sounds so weird to say. Reminds me kind of a bit of Romania.
All right.
Because they're both countries that have had a sort of big, sort of nation-defying history that have sort of made their cinematic output sort of skewed in a way. Romania had communism, which meant they only could produce movies of so and so, these big historical epics that we've been talking about, and there were also a lot of censorship and things like that. Korea, of course, had the Japanese occupation, it had, World War II, it had the Korean War, it had a lot of stuff, which
and a dictatorship in the 60s.
Yeah. So it basically meant that Korea couldn't really, like Romania, couldn't really establish a cinematic language until at least the 50s.
Pretty much.
Which is what they call
World War II.
Yeah, which is what they call the golden age in Korean cinema.
The 70s is already where the censorship got back because of the dictatorship.
Yeah.
By Park Chung-hee.
Yeah. And then, of course, in the 1980s, when the dictatorship sort of died.
Well, Park Chung-hee was assassinated in 79.
Yes, it died.
I just wanted to be specific.
It
wasn't a metaphorical death.
Yeah, but they started, building their cinematic output back up, which has basically been going on until today, where they have sort of found themselves a very comfortable international footing, but also a very steady domestic output.
Like in most countries around the world, the cinema or film in general was introduced at the end of the 19th century. So at that point, due to Japanese occupation, the Koreans would only see propaganda pieces produced in Japan.
Yeah.
Now, in between 1910 and 1945, what is considered the start of a motion picture produced in Korea is a movie called The Righteous Revenge, which technically is not a movie. It is considered a kino drama, meaning the actors would act the piece live on stage, while the background would be a projected scene that would act as the backdrop of the scene that the two actors are playing. So they filmed stuff for it, but it's not a traditional movie. The early attempts were still heavily censored, so at this point, during the 20s, 30s, and 40s, they started producing their own stuff. But of course, it was censored by the Japanese occupation. Fun fact, early screenings during the silent era had live narrators in the theater describing the action because they were silent movies. Now, if Japanese soldiers were not present at these screenings, the narrator would start riffing and making fun of the Japanese soldiers. Now, an interesting case of Japanese censorship is in 1941 with the film You and I, which depicted a Korean-Japanese interracial relationship. And because of that, the movie was banned. And that is considered one of the things that contributed to the fact that all Korean language films were banned by the year 1942. The Japanese occupation ended in 1945, and after that, the government wanted to build up, like you said, their cinema industry. All the Korean films made in Korea received tax breaks, and this basically skyrocketed the number of films produced per year. And this was, as you said, the beginning of the golden age. It was because the tax break that, allowed more movies to be made on a cheaper budget.
Although there was still government censorship through the golden age.
Yes, there was. This golden age period, up until the 60s, deals a lot with the post-World War II era and, into the Korean War thing. So there's a lot of resentment towards war and also like a reflection on newfound freedoms, post-occupation. But the dictatorship was installed by the beginning of the 60s and then into the late 70s by Park Chung-hee, who heavily censored everything. The reports say that production went from 71 films per year in the golden age to 16, and those produced were largely propaganda pieces.
Yeah.
And as we said, he was assassinated in 1979. Of note, in 1979, director Shin Sang-uk was allegedly kidnapped by North Korea in order to make propaganda films for them. He directed a North Korean Godzilla ripoff titled Pulgasari in 1985. That's such a meme face. In general, though, just as I mentioned, North Korean films market peaked pretty much during the 80s, but then struggled to find its footing in the 90s and later on, largely due to famine.
Yeah.
For example, in 1988, there were 88 films produced that year, but only 44 got the approval to be released to the public. Even though this censorship still existed, this period is still seen as one with a lot of Korean films receiving international recognition, such as The Oldest Son. There was a huge financial crisis in 1997, which hurt the film industry, but they recuperated pretty quickly with the 1999 movie Shiri, which is considered the first Korean blockbuster. And this is considered as the point where the door opened towards the domestic and international distribution for movies such as Oldboy in 2003, The Host 2006, Train to Busan 2016, and of course the most recent one, Parasite, in 2019.
Yeah.
So there you go. Daniel, I wanted to ask, what was your first Korean film that you ever seen that you can remember?
It must have been Oldboy.
Yeah, probably the same for me.
It must have been Oldboy because a lot of sort of the film nerds, let's be fair, that I talked to were like, "Oh, you gotta see Oldboy," and things like that. Like Oldboy was very much a film that was talked about when I was younger and getting into film. Korean cinema outside of Korea, especially in our circles, people who are a fan of films.
Jackoffs.
Film nerds, basically.
Yeah.
I refuse to call us cinephiles.
It kind of sounds like pedophiles, doesn't it?
Within that group, there is sort of two Korean filmmakers today that sort of stand out, and that is, of course, Bong Joon-ho, who has garnered a lot of success over the years with movies like culminating basically in Parasite last year.
Yeah.
And then there is Park Chan-wook, who did Oldboy, and did a lot of other movies that not a lot of people are talking about. We will be talking about his movie Thirst, which is probably one of his least talked about movies.
And I have seen it before. I'm very excited to watch it again.
I have never seen it before. So
I think it's a very good movie.